This year so far in the UK, the government has issued £275 billion in new debt, issuing bonds to cover the cost of furloughed workers and all the other support that's been needed to get the economy back on track. And come August, they're probably going to issue even more debt. Already the debt accrued totaled more than £2.4 trillion, more than the GDP of the country in 1 year. It's the first time that has happened for 57 years. So how do you pay for it? The government issues bonds, people buy the bonds, or if there's not enough people to buy the bonds, then the Bank of England buys them up. At some point, the expectation is that the central bank will then want to sell them back on the open market. But what if they don't bother? Then there's absolutely no reason why the government has to pay back the debt to pay out the cost of those bonds issued. You could just count it as extra money added to the circulation, in effect created by the central bank. So how will that work out? Well, we'll look at that today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobie. So what is wrong with the idea that the central bank just issues money to cover government debt and not expect the government to pay it back? Well, convention has it that if you expand the money supply too much, which is in effect what the central bank is doing by issuing that money, you get runaway inflation, because we all see the value of our dollar or our pound or our krona or our ruble or Eritrean Nafka, it doesn't matter where you are, we all see it as being worth a little bit less if there's so much more of it around. But, you know, guess what? The coronavirus has been a stimulus to create a massive increase in the supply of money in the UK, where we've, and it's the same everywhere else, but in the UK, we've gone from a little over £2.4 trillion in circulation in January up to about £2.65 trillion by April, and it's still going up. That's a 10% increase in the M2 money supply. Most of that is, of course, going to be coming from central banks issuing more money to buy those government bonds to cover this increase in government debt. So has to be a realization of that's actually what's really working. And actually, it's different from in normal times when we don't have a virus. The biggest issuer of debt is commercial banks issuing it for home loans, but we're not taking out home loans at the moment. Most of the money is being created to cover this excess spending by the government. So why don't we just live with it?
Yeah, and this is advantageous in one sense in terms of clarifying what actually happens. Whether anybody will ever take notice of it is another story. But non-orthodox economists from Basil Moore forward have been saying that the government can finance itself internally. This is the whole message of modern monetary theory, the important core message, that the government can create as much money as it needs, fundamentally by the Treasury selling to the central bank. However, laws have been passed over the last century saying that can't be done. The Treasury must, in fact, sell its bonds to the financial sector. But of course, then the central bank, to maintain the target interest rate it sets, has always been involved in what are called open market operations, buying and selling bonds off the financial sector. So it's a roundabout route. Now, because of the coronavirus, bang, that law went out the window. And the story is if the Treasury wants to create, for example, £100 billion worth of money to inject directly into the economy through people's bank accounts, it creates £100 billion nominal value of bonds. Sell those to the central bank. Central bank says, okay, we work those on our asset side. Here's £100 billion we're putting into our liability side, the account of the Treasury, and the Treasury can then put that directly into people's bank accounts through all the financial supports we've seen through the coronavirus. So it's a direct injection, direct creation of money.
Right. But it's still sitting on the balance sheet, isn't it, at the central bank? The expectation is that they will wind that balance sheet back down again at some point. Although, interestingly, since 2008, it seems like they never do. And in the United States, when they tried to do that, when they tried to wind back QE, for example, they realized they made a mistake. And even before we got into the coronavirus, they were starting to extend their money supply and issuing more QE.
Yeah, well, this is one of the ironies of reading the mainstream about this, because and it may even be that who's the new governor of the Central Bank of England, or the
Andrew Bailey, isn't it?
Andrew Bailey. It looked like he's read too many textbooks as well, from what he had to say in Bloomberg recently. They believe that banks lend out reserves, but quite literally, that when the bank makes a loan, the reserves must go down. Now, firstly, that is simply not possible unless the money is taken out in cash. And this is the the weird thing about reading the mainstream is because they don't pay sufficient attention to how banks actually operate, because in the models banks don't matter, and therefore they haven't developed decent models of banks to begin with. But their mental picture is, oh, well, they've got this bucket of money called reserves, and they take money out of that and they give it to you as the public as loans, and therefore when the bank lends, their reserves go down. Garbage. For the only way the reserves go down is if they actually get taken out of the banking sector. And the one that we get taken out of the banking sector is if people take out in the form of cash. And rather than living, if you and I make a payment between each other, it goes from my deposit account to your deposit account. The reserves of my bank goes down. The reserves of your bank goes up by precisely as much, and there's no change. And then when they lend, they don't lend out of reserves. They create a new asset called a loan on the asset side of the ledger. They whack exactly the same amount of money in the liability side of the deposit account. The reserves are unaffected. So this, it's crazy to watch this
crazy
stuff. Well,
Andrew Bailey actually should read, I mean, it's only 14 pages. I'm sure he's got the time. He should read Money Creation in the Modern Economy by Michael Maclay, Amar Raidia and Dryland Thomas. It's an interesting paper put out by, the Bank of England. Perhaps he should have read that before he started the job.
This is what
it pretty much explains it.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking with a couple of my colleagues on Twitter and on this whole front, and you get somebody running the Bank of England who doesn't understand what the Bank of England's research centre has worked out for themselves, and this is because they got appointed to the Monetary Policy Committee or whatever they call the I think the FOMC is the initials of the Federal Reserve's one. They get appointed because of past service to the financial sector, not because they're up with the latest research from their own bank staff. So they start putting forward policies that have got diametrically opposed to the knowledge their own bank staff have of how the monetary system.
So the danger about creating money, the argument that's often given, like where we are now, where we are expanding the money supply quite significantly. Well, 10% is quite significant. It's more in other parts of the world, like in Australia, for example. I'll come back to that because if you've got a low balance sheet, then the percentage increase is going to be greater, and I wonder whether that shocks the economy in any way. But the expectation is, isn't it, if you expand the money supply too much, you get inflation, and that's when people start bringing up Zimbabwe in 2008 or whenever it was, and Germany with its printing money to pay their war reparations after the war. But is there? I mean, obviously there's a concern. If you do too much, you are going to get inflation. And in fact, Zimbabwe is back at it, of course, because their money supply last year increased threefold, which is a bit different to the 10% we've just seen in the UK. So is there a tipping point? Is that people taking extremes and saying, "Oh, look, this happens, you get inflation. If you expand the money supply threefold, you'll get inflation." Well, no surprise there. But 10%, 20%. 50%? I mean, do we know at a point at which you're going to create problems? I know there's many other factors, like, for example, is the virus going on and is demand subdued? But in normal times, have we got an idea of what that percentage might be?
No, well, we don't, because the pressure has always been in the opposite direction, to reduce the amount of money that governments create and let it be created by the private banking sector. So in terms of having an actual experiment to see what actually happens, forget the theory. What's the empirical data show us? We haven't seen anything like that scale of increase in the money supply at any stage in a Western nation with a fully functioning production system ever. We've only seen these things when you have something like the Weimar Republic, when there's after the First World War, which I think may have destroyed a few machines here and there. The Zimbabwe experience, where there was a wholesale destruction of the farming sector by what was portrayed as being, I don't know the Zimbabwe system well enough to be strong on this, but Mugabe pretending he was making things better for black farmers by dispossessing white farmers and effectively destroying destroying the productive capacity of the farming sector and then printing to compensate. It's only in extreme areas where there's been destruction of physical resource capability in some manner that we've seen runaway money creation and then runaway rates of inflation. So in terms of a country, no country of the scale of the UK, America, outside of being defeated in a war, has had a period of hyperinflation. And yet every time any change in money suppliers talked about, people, won't that cause inflation?
So if it doesn't cause inflation, why are we so obsessed about it? Why is this expectation that we have to control the money supply and stop the government getting into debt? And if they do get into debt, that money has to be paid back. We'll look at that in the full version of this podcast. To listen to that, you need to become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen, or become a subscriber at debunkingeconomics.com. Hopefully you'll do one of those two things, and we'll see you back here to listen to this episode and all the others. There's more than 200 of them. You can listen to them all once you're a paying subscriber. So hopefully you'll do that, and we'll see you back here again very soon. I'm Phil Dobie. He's Steve Keen. Thanks for listening.